Well, Diligent have flown their VP and internationally renowned technology evangelist, Dottie Schindlinger, whose new book, Technology in the Boardrooms, has just been released. Diligent are a long-standing partner with whom we've engaged on a range of key events and thought leadership, and we're thankful to them for sponsoring this session, Technology, Modern Governance and Human-Centred Design, chaired by the CEO of the Governance Institute of Australia, Megan Motto. Please welcome them.
Is this girls versus boys? Or no, you take a seat on here.
Ooh, that's my favourite one.
And look, thank you so much, and thanks again to Diligent. What a fantastic past panel that was. Not many times that you're going to have an AM and two AOs on the stage all at the same time in a conference. Pretty impressive. Thank you for that. And I just wanted to shout out once again to Diligent being the sponsor of this particular session. Now, the bios, of course, are in the packs and on your apps, so I'm not going to go into those. But Dottie, I'm going to start with you. You have the coolest title in the world, Governance Technology Evangelist. We all want a title. Has anyone got a title that's cooler than that in the room? I would think not. Now, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the book and about the capability of directors in the boardroom with regards to technology. In particular, I wanted to talk about how every company today, whether they think they are or not, they are a digital company. I reflect on this conference, I reflect on the work of the Governance Institute. Every single person in the room today received a communication about this conference via a digital tool, whether it be by an email or a social media or our website or any other type of media. So they received the information and communications via a digital tool. You probably all booked through our website, you all via a direct marketing tool. You paid via that website, you were informed of your registration, you've turned up, you've obviously all downloaded and busy using the app and Twitter to talk about and develop community around this conference. Now, we are a digital company, but many companies just don't have the depth of experience in the boardroom when it comes to understanding the digitisation of all companies in Australia and how the game has changed. Did you want to talk about that a little bit and about what you found in your book?
Sure, no, I'd be happy to. Can you hear me all right? Okay, there we go. So Megan, just to reflect for a moment on the title, which is kind of funny, I think that's sort of a really American thing, maybe? I'm not sure. But at any rate, so you're absolutely right. I think that there is a long way for us to go to ensure that we have the level of expertise that we need in the boardroom on digital disruption, digital technology, innovation. In fact, Andrew and I were talking in the speaker ready room a little bit ago about the fact that even when boards have committees that are asking questions around digital innovation and digital technology, it tends to be the risk and audit committee, which is really looking at it through the lens of what's the risk associated with different technologies, and not an innovation committee, which is looking at across the horizon to determine what are the next trends coming that could impact our business. And what's so fascinating is I really think you'd be very hard pressed to find any other part of a business that hasn't been dramatically transformed by digital technology. And yet somehow the boardroom remains this final frontier. Right? And I'm not just talking about getting your board papers online. I'm really talking about how the board knows things, how they understand things, how they can do their due diligence, how they can stay one step ahead of the competition, and how they can ensure that they're creating value for stakeholders and shareholders in a meaningful way, and make sure that the strategy that management is bringing to them is sound. And if you think about the kinds of expenditures that they may have to approve, right? So let's say that there's a $150 million expenditure on some piece of technology, but there's not a single person in the room when they make that decision that knows anything about that technology. I think that's a risk. And what's sort of interesting is we don't necessarily take that same approach with anything else. If you were to replace the word cyber with finance or legal, I think boards would all understand that they have a responsibility to be competent on those areas of risk. But somehow we replace the word with cyber, and it's sort of like, well, I don't really bother with that. That's not something I really know very much about, so that'll be something that management will handle. So it's still very puzzling to me. There was some research put out last year by Deloitte taking a look at the percentage of technology expertise in boardrooms globally. And what they found was that only 17.4% of boards had even one director in the room that had any technology expertise. And they defined technology expertise in a very low bar. It was they had to have had a professional role in information technology at a leadership level for a minimum of 1 year. And only 17.5% of boards met that threshold. Now, when you look at the top performers, the companies that are performing the best on the S&P 500, they have a little bit greater percentage, but it's still only 31%, which is kind of astounding. As you think about the top performers, we're talking about the FANG companies, right? Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google. So not even these companies have a predominance of technology expertise in their boardrooms. It's really very fascinating. So I think we have a long way to go.
Yeah, I want to explore just the shifting business models that you talked about a little bit, Andrew. You're, technology guru, innovation guru, data guru.
Goodness, take it easy.
Take it easy. But we were talking when we had our call about the fact that it's not just about the use of technology in the boardroom, but it's the business models that underpin the fastest growing business and the disruption that's happening in the business models themselves. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? It's
exactly those companies that Dottie's just talked about. If you look at, and even in the Australian context, there's the WACS, there's WiseTech through to Xero, and the Appen is another one, of companies that have a platform business model that is implemented on technology. And these companies are growing at disproportionate rates. Their employment growth is the highest. Their shareholder value creation is the highest of anywhere. And it just seems odd that, picking up Dottie's point, that boards do not have, sufficient or more, at the very least, technology capability than they have, recognising where shareholder value is being created. It's quite staggering, and it's quite apparent if you just look at the value of those FANG companies and how significant, what a major proportion of the S&P 500 that they are now occupying in terms of revenue growth and margin, operating margin, not overall net profit as yet, but they are growing like crazy. And you'd think that all of us would be getting onto that model, because it's not like it's an experiment, it's not like it's a pilot. This is a proven thing and something highly beneficial, I think, for all businesses. The other thing to reflect on, and this is my own perspective, is it's sort of odd that directors would be about the most flexible working, mobile operating group that you will find in any business. So anyone who has checked emails on their phone, is working on their laptop, and whatever is working flexibly. Directors are, by definition, because they're non-executive in most cases, are working flexibly. And their use of technology, like Diligent, is leading the way. And it seems odd that there's that level of operation in their working life, and yet somewhat of a vacuum in some areas in terms of how digital and technology can transform the businesses that they're governing. Somehow it's hard to reconcile those two.
Yeah, absolutely. Diane, I wanted to go to you, and I have to say, like a parent should never have a favourite child, as a CEO I'd never have a favourite member of the Governance Institute of Australia, but gee whiz, you come close with your passionate advocacy of the Governance Institute and your support and assistance, Diane, so thank you so much for that to start off with. You sit on so many boards. I heard you reflecting that if you have any more boards, you'll have to go to a second front page of Diligent to fit them all on, which is just absolutely incredible. Amongst that vast experience, what tools do you see that directors are using to upskill themselves beyond, getting a sibling or a child to, get them a Facebook account or something like Instagram? So what tools are directors using to upskill themselves?
What an interesting question. You can only work out the tool that you need to upskill yourself if you know the problem that you're trying to address. And so listening to Dottie and Andrew talk about this, I really worry about this notion that we need to have all of these skill sets resident around the table, because I can see that board with 30 people, because we've got the person that's good at technology, and then we've got the person that's good at the partnering operating model, and then we've got the person that knows about actual cyber and deep privacy and digitisation. So I'm very much still of the place where I'm saying that the model that we use at the moment of having a diverse group of people with access to outside experts is still a very strong model. And so one of the key methods for me of working out what I need to be learning next is to actually think about that outside group of experts that I'm working with, and where do they think things are coming next, what's going to be coming around the corner. I think the thing that's coming around the corner is operating model change, as Andrew said. You know, I've been on the Wesfarmers board for almost 10 years now, and when I joined Wesfarmers, it was a very different beast than it is today. And just in the last year, we've done two really different things. One is that we've acquired Catch, which is a digital marketplace to sit next to our traditional bricks and mortar businesses. And the other is that we demerged Coles. But in the process of doing that, we retained a 50% JV ownership in Flybys. And so you think about the difference that that makes to how Wesfarmers had worked in the past, because our model was always autonomous operating divisions. Very little collaboration, some fantastic internal benchmarking on things like safety and costs and so forth, but not a lot of collaboration past that. Now, of course, Flybys, which is across a number of our businesses, and Catch, which will do the same, makes a completely different world. So how do you, as a director, prepare yourself for that world? And I really do think it's a difficult task, but it's a task that we each have to hold ourselves. And I see with the corporate governance guidelines that now all the company secretaries in the room are going to be responsible for director induction. And I looked at that and I thought, I tell you what, there's not a board that I'm going to chair while my bottom is pointing to the ground that I will outsource responsibility for director induction and ongoing education to the company secretary, much as I may love them. That to me is a board responsibility. So you've got to have your individual growth and learning and so forth, and you've got to then do it as a collective. And so I think that's the trick. It's the board as a group has got to decide the skilling that it needs, because it's part of that succession conversation.
Is that what you're seeing in America, Dottie? Is that combination of collective upskilling with the addition of either buying in the expertise or just buying the company? Is that the sort of combination of things that you're seeing in the US?
I mean, it very much has to be a combined approach. I mean, to your point, you can't just wholesale remove every director that's in the room right now and replace them with tech experts, right? You really can't do that, maybe as much as you might wish to. You can't do it. And you also don't want a board of 30 people, to your point. A colleague of mine a million years ago used to call that the Noah's Ark approach to board composition, where it's you need 2 attorneys and 2 former CEOs and 2 CPOs. So no, we don't want to do that. But I do think that you do need a combination. And it is important because the board won't know what it doesn't know. Right, so you may be confronted with something, and if you have absolutely no basis of expertise whatsoever, you may not even know when you need to bring in outside experts, right? So it's a matter of ratcheting up the level of education across all of the directors, and not just relying on 1 or 2 tech experts in the room. And in fact, that really becomes very important, because in some cases what we were seeing were boards bringing in 1 or 2 tech directors, sort of the tech director, whatever that means. And that person might be a cyber risk expert, or might be an expert in blockchain or in AI. Well, now all that does is take every conversation towards blockchain or AI or cyber risk, right? So they look at it through that one lens. And what you really need is just to provide a broad base of experience and knowledge for all directors. They need to start to read more. They need to start to go out to educational sessions, bring in outside experts, and some of the things that we heard worked the best were taking them out of the boardroom and going to visit, for example, the R&D department of a local university, or the R&D department of a non-competing industry that is in some way related to your business. A good example was Betsy Atkins, who is the chair of the board of Volvo Cars, and she also happens to be on the board of Schneider Electric. So she decided to take the board of Volvo to go visit the R&D department at Schneider. Why? Because Schneider is actually involved in creating technologies that will be part of the infrastructure for self-driving cars. So it was an opportunity to take this board from Volvo and get them, head to head with the scientists and understand what they're doing and the questions they're running into and the problems they have. And when they went back to the boardroom at Volvo, they spoke about issues on a completely different level now. So I think it's a matter of getting that kind of knowledge.
Yeah, but isn't that an interesting thing, though? It sort of had to rely on the fact that that one director happened to be on the other thing. Right. And we did a very similar thing at one of my boards, where we had the luck of having a director who was on the Qantas board, and so we were able to go and look at their safety systems. You know, and everyone would love to do that. But again, it's that sort of serendipity. And you think we would have moved past this sort of stuff, but clearly not yet.
Yeah, but I think that's one of the great things about conferences like these and about networking across peers. I think that's actually why that is so important these days, because it's not just about building skill and content, it's about connecting with someone to make those opportunities happen quite visibly, quite forcefully, to be more orchestrated than they would be serendipitous.
But can I just add, Megan, before you go to the next one? Safety is a good example, I think, Diane, because both you and Dottie have mentioned, and Dottie and I talked about why we're hyperventilating in the speaker room, getting fired up for this, is this whole concept of dealing with things that we don't know is a problem yet. And so there's two types of risks, I think, that we've got to deal with as directors. First is the risk of action. So if we do something, there will be risks inherent in taking that course of action. And the alternative, which is much more difficult, which brings the safety example, is the risk of inaction, which is what happens if we don't do something about this. And if you look at tech disruption, for example, tech disruption is a very, very good example of something that I would say doesn't get talked about enough at the board level, because it's something that is a risk of inaction rather than a risk of action. And I agree that you can't just keep adding more and more specialists, because you tend to get narrower into their specialist area. But safety is a model that says actually the boards are worried about the risk of inaction and inappropriate systems, processes and environment created for employees. And so that is almost another, just take out safety and put cyber security in there. It could be the same, because it's a safety-oriented thing, and this risk of inaction is, I think, the sleeper for most boards is, how do we know what we don't know? And you talk about, Megan, about events like this, which are great, but in the end, we've got to be able to get to those things, and sometimes governance principles help us, sometimes areas and information exchange and thought leadership helps us, but we've got to be able to get ourselves to understand those things, because if you look at the victims of the FANG's business models, I bet those companies didn't spend enough time looking at the risk of doing nothing.
Right.
This is interesting, because you're saying if you don't understand, you've got to move towards understanding. Well, when people don't understand, they get very fearful about things.
Yep.
And it's hard to be vulnerable, and it's hard to sort of say, well, I don't get this, how do we move it forward? So if you think about where safety is now, it's becoming much more, it's a non-financial risk. You look at finance, there's a language around that we all understand. It's very common. We've got all these wondrous accounting standards. So you sort of get the things you're supposed to worry about, revenue recognition, how you capitalise things, inventory, yada, yada. When it comes to safety, I think we're starting to move through that now. People are really understanding that dynamic of, I eliminate a hazard. If I can't eliminate, I modify. If I can't modify, the critical controls hierarchy. Much better language, much more standardisation around what's a good TRIFR, what's a bad TRIFR, how does TRIFR, interact with major hazards and so forth. I think with technology, that's got to be the new frontier for some of this sort of stuff. Yeah. And then the next one will be stuff around business models. But until we get a common language and start to be able to understand it that way around the board table, I think people will be a bit fearful.
And I think the shorthand version I use to do that is, I look at what amount of time are we talking about the threat, and what amount of time are we talking about the opportunity. Yep. And because each and every technological disruption has an equal and opposite threat and opportunity. And if you look at the ethics of AI as an example, in Australia, you'd say we spend all of our time worrying about the threat of AI, and not the reality that says, if we adopted AI more aggressively and more effectively than other countries, it would make a huge contribution to the competitiveness and prosperity of the nation. Now, we are underweight on the opportunity of AI, and yet most of us would have big problems in our lives if Google Maps didn't work for us, if many of those things didn't work. We'd have immediate implications if AI was not there rather than it being there. So I'm not rose-coloured glasses, but that opportunity and threat vortex, I think, is useful, because you've got both of those things to weigh up. because all of these things are actually a balance. They really are.
It's interesting because normally when you'd look at a risk register, you'd look at how you're mitigating your high risks, and yet you never necessarily, so you're looking at bringing those high risks down, but never necessarily turning them into opportunities, which is that next step.
Yeah, it's almost, if you go through your assessment of risk and risk appetite, if you almost turned all of those round the other way and said, if we were doing those to the positive extreme rather than the negative, would that be our strategy as an organisation? In many cases it is, actually.
The key that we heard about, we were researching the book, everyone was telling us, look, the most important thing is to facilitate and fuel curiosity. You want the board to be very curious about everything, about what's happening out in the world, different technologies that might be coming, and could we just have a hypothetical conversation around, would this technology present some type of disruption? And just getting that muscle strong, just doing that on a regular basis makes a huge difference. So I think it's that sort of curiosity that leads to a lot of resilience for companies, that they can weather these storms because they've thought about it before. They've considered it as a possibility and have some ideas of what they might do.
Fantastic. Now, you've probably noticed that when we had our pre-session hookup, we did contemplate the fact that we could just have a conversation between the four of us probably for a couple of hours. You can go about your business, that's fine, but we could keep on talking. There will be questions, but before I throw to the audience for questions, I wanted to jump tack because the whole conference, this whole themed conference is around people and bringing the people to the centre of the conversation.
Yep.
And so that concept of human-centred design, it's really interesting. A conversation that is really happening very, very poignantly at the moment is this concept of privacy and whether or not privacy should be a human right. Mm-hmm. And so we've got into where human analytics, data analytics, the concept of loss of privacy. There's a flip side to all of that though, because technology is an enabler of, and you were talking about flexible work before, but it's usability creates access for people that didn't have access to all sorts of human rights in the past. So mobility, ethical deployment, security, supply chain ethics. So I want to just talk about the people-centred element and whether or not you think boards are having that conversation enough, or whether they're taking those technology conversations just as looking at technology as a tool rather than the dividend that comes out.
Yeah. I think it's evolving and very, very quickly. So to set the context for my comments on this, I'm chairing the data standards body that is developing the technical standards for the open banking regime that's being rolled out and will be live in February. In fact, product reference data is already available. And one of the questions that so the Treasury and the Treasurer set have developed and passed the legislation, the Parliament's passed the legislation. The ACCC is establishing the rules, and today they've published the rules that will apply from February. If you look on their Consumer Data Standards website, you'll see that. And we're developing the standards, which are how the data is actually delivered in machine-readable form to the data recipients in the process. And one of the obligations on us in the data standards body is to develop guidelines for the customer experience in this world. And if I said to you that I think that the big impact of what we're doing is the whole recognition and changing of consent, that we will all consent. So rather than the use of data being buried deep in terms and conditions in the financial and other products that you're using, you will have the opportunity to consent to the use of data and the portability of that data. And we're trying to work out what is the best way to do that, recognising the current environment of the people who will use it and the intended policy intent, which is about consumer opportunity and enhanced competition. And I was sort of reflecting when we were hearing from Peter and Jane before, that there was sort of a distance between, and we'll decide how people will actually use this sort of stuff, when the reality is, and this is how we're going about the process, we've engaged 3 separate parties and we've done some of the work ourselves to actually look at human-centred design and observe people and say, for example, would you share your financial data? And if you ask an open question like that, just will you share your financial data, or your banking data, not payments, 55% of people said yes, and obviously 45% no. If you explain the reason as to why you might want to share that data, there's an increase of 39 percentage points on top of the 55, so you get quite high. And so already we're trying to tease apart this propensity to share data, so the ability to revoke your consent increases the willingness to share, but reputation and privacy issues and breaches of that trust actually diminish it very, very quickly. And the other one, this won't shock you, is in consumer privacy, consumers are very aware and display a level of tension between convenience and security. So there's this trade-off. I'd very much like to do this with absolutely zero friction, but I'm not as sure about the security of that data. And so what we've done is we've recruited people, and to give you an idea of the lengths we've gone to, we've looked at age and technology skill. We've looked at vulnerability, disadvantaged and marginalised groups, so people in financial distress, LGBTIQ people with disabilities, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and asked all of those groups these sorts of questions and put in front of them 3 different consent and authentication processes. And guess what? They can tell us what they prefer. Now, there's none of them that don't meet the information security protocols and requirements of the banks and indeed of the third-party information security people. But our objective is to find something that, if it's a consumer and competition reform, that isn't so secure that no one will ever want to use it, so the thing flops. Conversely, it's so easy to use that there's no security there. And the answer is users understand it. They actually understand it. We also looked at diversity of demographics. And to show the lengths we've gone to, we've actually also recruited some people who have separated from a partner where they used to have a joint account. Because if you think about a joint account and there's a separation, whether or not there's a domestic violence issue or not, there is a big consent question there, and those people will very clearly tell you. So human-centred design is at the heart of the governance regime that we've put in place for data standards in the consumer data right. And I think the importance of consent and so on is, and ethics and AI I mentioned earlier, I think we're on a path here to say, I think this human-centred design element is a path to real understanding, real adoption, real security, and real efficacy in what we're doing, in not only in what we're doing, but more generally in tech. And if you asked those same sorts of questions about board directors and the technology enablement they'll use, I think they'll tell you the answers pretty clearly, whether they understand the bits and bytes or not, which I think that's irrelevant. So we're seeing a very direct involvement at the governance level of human-centred design and actually asking people, because if you look at people 18 to 30, 31 to 40, 41 to 50 and 51 to 60, as to how they engage with technology and when they're going to use their financial data to access new financial products, new energy products, new insurance products, new superannuation products, they will tell you, because they'll tell you where today they're concerned and where they're not. And I think there's something quite a breakthrough here in terms of governance, in actually trusting people out there. The one plus of social media is that it has a back channel. And we can hear, sometimes we don't like what we hear that's coming back from social media, but we can hear very clearly what people's attitudes and their behaviours are and their comments on things that we do, whether we're directors, we're governance professionals, or we're marketing people in companies. And I think there's quite an opportunity here for us, and we're seeing it firsthand in our regime. We'll see when it goes live and see the level of adoption that we see. But it's proving to be very interesting and quite different to anything I've experienced previously on any of the boards and indeed in any of the companies I've worked in.
Fantastic. Look, I know you...
all I have to say is, after listening to Andrew saying that, I'm absolutely glad that you're chairing that and not me, because it feels way above my pay grade.
Look, on that, I just wanted to throw to the audience, we've got some more questions. Of course, we could talk all afternoon, but any questions from the audience, please raise your hand and let us know who you are and where you're from, the usual conventions.
While we're waiting for that, I just have a comment about that. You know, what is it that makes directors really focus on this? And I think, as Andrew is pointing out, you've got to understand that if you do go and centre the design on the human, you're going to get a better outcome than you have in the past. It's not about you knowing the answer. But in the good old days, it was fine if 99% of things went well, because it was only 1%, wasn't it? Then we thought we got really clever by going, well, actually, how many people or how many instances or how many hours downtime is that 1%? And that focused our minds a bit more. But I think the thing that's really pushing us to work hard on this in the way that Andrew's talked about is that now we know, because of social media and also because of changing norms in the community, that often one instance of failure that impacts
is
a
enough,
person
right?
is too many.
Yeah.
And so that really means that you, as a director, you've got to start to remember that average is no longer your friend.
Yeah. And Peter, in the previous panel, talked about purpose. And how have we guided that human-centred evaluation? We've actually said this is about advancing the rights of the consumer and creating more competition for existing players. So it almost, inherent in that description of purpose, defines for you the questions that you will ask. It almost takes you, and so purpose is very, very important, and clarity of purpose in this case, combined with human-centred design, is something that, again, I must say, my eyes have been completely opened by it.
Questions from the audience before I throw another one to the panel? All right, so I wanted to just finish off, because we're known at the Governance Institute for being really practical. It's one of the things that we're known for. Other organisations will give you the how to do it, but we actually help with really practical tools. And I wanted to ask a question, that is, how as a director in the boardroom do you hold your management to account for large IT spend? So you know that you're going to have management that's going to want to invest in, whether it's customer-centric design analytics or a database or information gathering capabilities or whatever it might be. You're going to have an enormous spend that you don't quite understand. How do you get across the risk hurdle and the comfort level that you need to push the go button on that? And how do you then hold to account the return on that investment in what sort of timeframes are we using, what sort of analytics, what data do you use to
Well,
hold
you
to
saved
account
a really
the
short one for last, didn't you?
Yeah, it's an easy one. Nothing to it.
Well, you know, you link it up to your REM system is a really good way. At the end you said, you know, how long over 1, 2, 3 years? Of course it depends. Yeah. But I've always been a great fan of thinking about where am I, when does my budget cycle finish, and then I've got another 12 months. And it's really hard, in my mind, to sustain any sort of change and measurement over much longer than to the next budget and then one full year. So I like to chunk things down, and that was always the way I did it when I was an executive. So if I get a proposal that looks and feels too big and too long, I'm going to try to start putting those sort of parameters around it, get it into bite-sized chunks, and then I'm going to link it to the REM system. And if there's too much pushback on linking it to the REM, then I know there's a problem somewhere. So that's my simple answer.
There you go.
I would say that, I mean, it's no different to making an investment if you're making an acquisition. There's a business case about the acquisition that the organisation, the management present to you, and it's exactly the same as what's the business case for this investment. And almost every acquisition will have some divergence from the business case, like every IT or every change project will have a degree of divergence. And really the question is, tell me what's different now from when you created the business case, and which of those relate to performance, or which relate to judgments, which relate to assessment and due diligence and others. And then the link to remuneration is obviously there, because are these the things that we should have known? Are these the things that have changed and we could not have known them? Because the way in which those find their way linked to remuneration are vastly different. But I think it's the same as any investment, and you just have followed the same way. And don't get too bamboozled by the technology part of it. It's a project. It's an investment. It's an acquisition of something that says, here's how we do it. We want to say, what did we intend to do? And then what happened? What was the differences? And explain the variances. And if you can't explain the variances, it's not a good picture. It's not a good picture.
Dottie,
how are you managed, Dottie, with your projects?
I was going to say, people invest in your technology on a regular basis. How do you go about demonstrating to the return on investment?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of different ways that you can do that, but I would say one just sort of blanket comment that I think is a good practical thing is, as you're making decisions about investments in any technology, you don't want the only source of the information you have about whether it's good or bad to come from either the vendor or from the IT director, right? So you want to make sure that you are doing your due diligence, just like you would with anything else. So you maybe speak to some peers, maybe you look at some reviews, maybe you go out and read a few articles, you try to assess it from a number of different angles, and then you can make a good decision. A good example, actually, from the book, we interviewed a director by the name of John Hinshaw, who's worked as a IT director for many times, a CIO for many, many years. And he was saying, sometimes CIOs will come in the room and ask for $150 million expenditure around cybersecurity and security perimeters, and they speak in all jargon. and the board is sort of left at sea trying to understand what it is that this person is actually asking for money to pay for. And they don't really have any good way of weighing, is this the framework that we should be investing in, or is it something else? And what is this going to cost over the long term? So I guess just the practical advice would be, don't make that one conversation the only place that you get information to make that decision. So really go out and do your homework just like you would with an acquisition or any other expenditure.
Fantastic advice and very practical. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please join with me thanking our fabulous panel this afternoon, Andrew, Diane and Dottie. Thank you so much.